Harley Davdson, a brand name that needs no real introduction. Founded out of a small shed in 1903 by William S. Harley and brothers Arthur and Walter Davdson, it was a humble operation at first. Incorporated in 1907, it was one of many bike manufacturers operating at the time. Fast forward more than a century later, and the Harley Davdson brand is so rooted in American culture that the history of the company intertwines with the modern history of America itself, becoming the well-known brand it is today. While Harley Davdson has managed to outlast most of its domestic competitors, just like any business, it faced commercial challenges that could have been detrimental to the viability of the company. This was the case in the early 1980s when Harley was facing a rising import bike market as high as 69%, therefore a decline in its domestic market share. To ease pressure and to stimulate growth, Harley approached regulators to impose a tariff rate quota, or TRQ, on all imports, motorbike imports. What this presentation will explore is if the tariff rate quotas were really effective, whether Harley was able to take advantage of these protective measures, and in doing so, whether they met the expectations of policymakers to reclaim competitiveness on the world markets. I'll also be providing my observations throughout. To answer these questions, we must first look at the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. A SWOT analysis. But what we are actually going to do is do it backwards, a TOES analysis, if you will. Why, I hear you asking? Well, as Peng describes in his book Global Business, strengths and weaknesses only have meaning in the context of what one is trying to accomplish in the workplace. He goes on to say that for companies trying to win, looking first at threats and opportunities and then evaluating strengths and weaknesses in that context provide a clearer path on which to focus on. Firstly, what are the threats to Harley? As discussed briefly before, the obvious one in this case study is the rising import market share of the heavyweight motorbike industry in the early 1980s. In 1980, imports held a 60% share of the market, increasing to 69% in 1982. By default, this decreased Harley's market share. The other main threats in the context of this case study are Harley's domestic competitors, Kawasaki and Honda America. While these two competitors were foreign-owned by Japanese entities, they did not fall under the new tariff scheme as they were assembled in the USA. Some of the opportunities for Harley within this period was to diverse some of its earnings to increase profitability, which it did by purchasing Holiday Rambler, a recreational vehicle manufacturer, and by producing other products like metal bomb casings and liquid fuel rocket engines for the US Department of Defense. Another opportunity for Harley was its rededication to quality. By implementing new quality circles, some of which had already been in place since 1976, Harley was able to improve the product and reduce costs by improving the just-in-time material management program, all of which was done with over 50% of employee involvement. Now that we have identified some threats and opportunities to Harley, we can now start to form an analysis in the direction Harley should go, for which I will go into more detail later. But first, let's continue with Harley's weaknesses and strengths. The main weakness I found with Harley within this case study is the infighting between staff and management. Infighting is normally down to a lack of communication between the two parties and can result in the detriment of operations and can further dent morale within any organisation, not just Harley. Before we go into the strengths of Harley, it is becoming clear that if Harley did follow a TOES approach, the main weakness of infighting between management and staff could have been avoided completely if they looked at the opportunity of involving the staff in their quality management program first, as both parties would have been inclusive on new ideas, thus promoting communication, and both parties could take ownership of the product, thus improving morale. Let's now look at the strengths of Harley, for which there are a few, but we'll focus on 3 main points in relation to this case study. The first and main strength is that Harley is an iconic brand, known throughout the US and the world. Another strength of Harley is that it is the only US-owned manufacturer which promotes a sense of nationalism. But is this really a strength? I'll go into more detail soon. The third main strength for Harley in relation to this case study is the government protection it received from the implementation of tariff rate quotas. While I might be at risk of rehashing the case study, for which I do want to avoid, I am going to go into detail to what tariff rate quotas are, as this will eventually lead me to answering the question if TRQs were truly effective in the case of Harley Davdson. A TRQ is a trade policy used to protect domestically produced commodities and combines, yep, you guessed it, quotas and tariffs. In a TRQ, the quota component works together with a specified tariff level to provide the desired degree of import protection. In the case of Harley, duties were raised to 45% in 1983 for foreign imports, steadily declining over a 5-year period to just 10% in 1988. So were the TRQs really effective? To answer the question directly, the answer is yes, it was effective. In 1982, imports were as high as 69% of the market share. This fell dramatically in 1984 to just 24%. A win for Harley, right? Wrong. Harley's 2 domestic competitors, Kawasaki and Honda America, immediately stepped up production as they too were under protection from the TRQ. They also began importing parts at an expedient rate to the point that it was estimated that between 50 to 70% of the final value of the domestically produced bikes was from imported parts. Because imported parts were not subject to the TRQ requirements, Harley still found itself on level, if not unequal ground, to their detriment when competing against these two competitors. Despite having protection, total worldwide market sales fell dramatically over this same period, and Harley had only increased its production by 20%, so its ability to reach maximum competitiveness on the world markets is indeed in question, and it indeed did not meet the expectations of lawmakers when they protected the iconic American brands. In fact, just like what happened in 1930 when the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was introduced to protect American companies, there was retaliatory action from Japan and a complaint was filed under the General Agreements for Tariffs and Trade for discriminatory action. Was a potential deterioration in relationships between the two states really worth it just for the protection of Harley? One of the 4 risks in international business is country risk, which includes what US lawmakers did by affording Harley protectionism status. It was fortunate that the only thing Japan did was make a complaint and not exercise its own tariffs or quotas upon exports from America, as this would have been a far more serious detriment to Harley, as it would have technically been the only heavy bike manufacturer affected, as Kawasaki and Honda America are technically Japanese owned. I believe that Harley was complacent in its belief that the company was so ingrained into the American psyche that it had a too big to fail mentality. By focusing on American culture roots, it may have been a detriment. As I mentioned when briefing on the TOES analysis, there is a sense of American nationalism when it comes to Harley. I did place this down as a strength, but to what cost would Harley focus on if this was ostracising major export markets like Japan and Germany, for which it had been doing business in for 50 and 80 years, respectively? Harley's competitive comeback in the late 1980s is one of the few protectionist stories to have a successful outcome, and they have definitely learned from their mistakes. Harley was great at diversifying into other industries while still not losing any of its brand awareness as a heavy bike with that muscly grunt of an engine. Further diversification, I believe, is key to their ongoing success. It needs to be the one-stop shop for everything Harley, including getting finance to buy a Harley. We spoke and Harley listened, creating the Harley Davdson financial services arm of its business, which is your start-to-finish place to get a loan for Harley, get insurance, extended services, and even protection plans. Harley has also began focusing on its people and culture a lot more. Harley don't just sell bikes, they provide a lifestyle that is so unique to its followers and creates a sense of camaraderie bond between all of its riders. In fact, it states in its 2027 objectives that it plans to build 2 million new riders who will carry on the torch for the brand into the next century on 100 new high-impact motorcycles that can be customised specifically for a rider. It is probably because of this personalised approach that sales have exceeded 3.3 billion in 2001 and will be one of the most enduring brands the world has ever seen. Thank you and good day.